this era. What is privacy? Yeah.
I don't quite understand why you neglected history, because we didn't.
It wasn't relevant for anything. So until a few years ago, it wasn't. No one really paid attention. No one was trying to understand what was going on. Like, I'm sure there's a lot of other stories, historical events that took place, at that time, before and after that, were not just relevant for historians to study. As you'll see, that I added one chapter from a book called The Known Citizen that was published a few years ago. That's one of the works that started analyzing this and started understanding what was going on at the time. But like historical research is like anything else, is a matter of fashion. People flock to one event, they study it, and then they move on to the next. And this is kind of what happened with this. So let's start with privacy. What is privacy? How would you define privacy?
WikiLeaks.
Sorry?
WikiLeaks. No, that's
Okay. What do you think privacy is? Yeah. Names, please.
No, yeah.
No, yeah.
I think privacy is access to information.
Access to information. Whose information?
Any person, but my privacy is first someone, or how to say it, if someone accesses my information or my data without giving that consent.
Okay, so if someone gains access to my data or information without my consent, that would be a violation of my right to privacy. Okay, other ideas. What is privacy? We talk a lot about privacy. Privacy is really, really important now. We all have our privacy settings on everything, and we all keep everything private, and privacy is really, really important. What is privacy? Yeah.
Maybe to have a realm which is not connected to the public, or where the public cannot access without your permission. So not necessarily data and information only, but also for the digital age, to have a realm, really, maybe the house, or maybe, this, how do you say, infrastructure, like public infrastructure, to have realms where you separate yourself from the public.
Okay. So it's two different things. So one thing that you said is to kind of disconnect myself from the world, to be able to disconnect myself from the world, and the other is who will have access to that. And where, if you know, maybe those of you studying law, where does the idea of privacy come from?
in the US, maybe the Fourth Amendment.
The Fourth Amendment? No, not really. The idea, the concept, the idea of where was when privacy defined? Yeah. Names, also. Sorry.
I don't know. I was thinking Locke, probably, but then I thought that the idea of the private sphere, the private sphere of the individual goes back to, I don't know, probably Greece or something like that. Goes as far back as one wants. But like the modern concept of privacy, I would say, so the 16th century.
Okay, so it's something that we need to kind of distinguish between private and public and privacy. It's two different things. And the idea of the private sphere comes, we can see like early ideas in the 17th century, 18th century, a lot of it in the 19th century. But ideas of private and public come from mostly like the 18th century. And there's different kinds of relationship between private and public. For example, ideas of capitalist economy. The origins of these ideas come from a very interesting relationship between private and public. For example, one of the most famous social and political theorists at the time, Bernard de Mandeville. If you heard this name, he wrote a very interesting book called Fable of the Bees, Private Vice, Public Virtues. And what he said there, that for a public to be virtuous, you don't need everyone to be virtuous. You need some kind of private vice. People need to be greedy. They need to do all sorts of kind of different bad things. But in general, that would create a better society. And the book was very controversial at the time. It went against Christian morality. But now and at the time, Mandeville was one of kind of the earliest theorists, again, social, political, but not so much of in economics, that explained this kind of relationship between private and public. And the way that economy works is not because I want to help others that I sell bread, it's because I want to make money. That's the only purpose why I do stuff. But the fact that I do it might help others because it will produce the bread that other people need to eat. And they will do something else that benefits me. But we're not doing this because we're thinking about other people. We're thinking about ourselves. And what motivates us is not any kind of what would make other people happy. It is only what would make me happy. And ideas at the time were very different of what needs to motivate people. The kind of intellectual revolution that these kinds of texts brought was that we need to consider or think about society in a completely different way. And also to show how the two things can go together. How can people be sometimes evil and greedy and be motivated by very, very, very bad feelings or sentiments, but that overall society would still be virtuous. And that idea kind of shaped later capitalist thought, but it started in what we know now, what we call now, and was also called at the time in some places, commercial society, which is kind of earlier stage of capitalist society. And we won't go into too much into this, but it's basically society that is based on commerce and not on capital. And that's the main difference between I produce something, I trade it with someone else. But I produce it because I want to make money or because I want to trade it for something else. In capitalist society, the idea, I have money, I buy something, I sell it. And the commerce itself is only used to get more money. And that's what motivates us. That's, again, 100 years a bit later than that. But it's also it's important to distinguish between the private sphere, the public sphere, and privacy. Privacy is something that is related to this, but it's not the same thing. Questions on that, because I saw some hand raising.
I was just asking, but you then covered like
Okay.
if the mechanism correlating with, let's say, vices to the overall virtue would be like some form of utilitarian argument. But yes.
Yes.
Individualist
Yeah.
utilitarian argument.
But also what we know now is, and Adam Smith came with in 1776. So after Mandeville was the invisible hand. There's some kind of organizing principle in society that turns all these private vice into some kind of public virtue. Sorry?
The author of the book.
Bernard de Mandeville. Catchy name. Yeah.
Just to be sure that I'm understanding that, but the distinguish that you've made is between private and public, not privacy.
Yes, that's private and public. Privacy is something else. And the first time that we actually hear about privacy is in text that is called The Right to Privacy, written in 1890 by two lawyers from Boston, Warren and Brandeis. Brandeis then becoming a very, very famous Supreme Court judge. And that is where the idea of privacy came from. And if you know, do you know Warren and Brandeis? Do you know that kind of the argument? Yeah.
Yeah, I remember the text.
The text, okay.
They have a definition of the text.
And the definition is of privacy is
The right.
to be the-
the right to be let alone. That's privacy. Oh, yeah, now we know it. Yeah. It's the right to be let alone. That's the original idea of privacy. And one of their arguments is that privacy already kind of exists in common law, but it's not really an official right. And there's a lot of, they were not famous at the time, they were very young at the time. It was published in the Harvard Law Review, 1890, no one really knew who they were, and they all of a sudden came up with this huge idea of what is privacy, and there's been a lot of historical research why and the reason why they wrote about it. There's some early text, there's a one text by Godkin, we'll go into this, that was written, was published a few months before. But the kind of accepted story, or let's say the narrative, is that Warren came from a very affluent family from the kind of Boston area. And one day, a newspaper took a picture or published a picture of his family at some kind of private gathering. And he was furious. And he felt that something was wrong, but there was no official right that would tell him why this is wrong. And they started to, the two of them started talking about why does this, oh, what happened here? And they started talking about why is this wrong, and what is the right that's or how they should fix this. And again, they started by thinking about how can they find legal ethical foundations for the this right in the common law. And we won't go too much into the argument, but the idea is something that is similar to what was being said, and it was based on new technological breakthroughs at the time, which were mainly cameras. It was much easier to take a picture than it was in the past. And now we had a new era where people, mostly newspapers, were able to take pictures of other people, and that had to be and that right had to become formed. And they talk a lot about this place of, as was mentioned before, this kind of place of solitude that we need to have as individuals, and they come up with the idea of the right to be let alone as the right that defines what privacy is. No one can enter your private sphere if you don't want them to enter that sphere. And that happened in 1890. And it is very, very interesting to see how not a lot changed in about 70 years. Until 1960, no one really talks about privacy. It is kind of, what we know in intellectual history, kind of a dead concept. There was Warren Breidnice's text, but there was not a lot of research done, theoretical, conceptual work done on what privacy actually is. And in another text that kind of went back to discuss what was going on at the time. In 1960, William Prosser, again, a very, very famous legal scholar, tried to understand the meaning of privacy coming from court rulings. And what he found was a complete mess. There was no one definition that courts used to establish what privacy actually is. And you find different kinds of interpretation of what privacy is. One of them is actually this violation of this right to be let alone. And sometimes it was used because someone used someone else's reputation or name It was used sometimes where people made false claims about people. In all of these cases, privacy as a concept or the right to privacy was used. But it didn't really mean anything. And the 1960s begin in a kind of understanding that we don't really have an idea of what privacy is. It is a complete legal mess, it's a complete conceptual mess. And there's another thing that people are starting to think about is, can we actually say that in a developed society, in a capitalist society, in a consumerist society in the 1960s, can we have this idea that we can be alone? Is it possible to block everyone from all the information about us? And if it's not, then what might the new idea of privacy be at this point in time? And this begins long discussion about what privacy is during this decade. But with this kind of realization that we don't really have an accepted definition or even an idea of what privacy actually means. And a lot has changed since the 1890s. It's not the same society, it's not the same politics, and it's not the same technology that they had in the 19th century, even in 1890. Questions on that before we move on? Yep.
Can you very briefly go over like the, if any, like proto privacy rights? Because I'm thinking that with the idea of religious freedom, you begin to have like this sort of private sphere.
Yeah.
And the idea of some form of privacy. Can you, because I don't want to keep the conversation in this.
No. It's so yes, and also your rights to property, that no one can do anything if it's not done after and in the 19th century, for example, that we see even the idea of liberty comes from a very kind of similar idea of privacy, that no one can tell you what to do if it does not interfere with others. But again, it's about protecting your private property. And even when you talk about liberty, it is kind of understanding of your life and body as your own property, that no one can interfere with. And that comes from Locke, from his idea of life and property. But again, it's more based on interference than in access. And the question of access would become more important during the 1960s and basically until today. Who can access my data, as was mentioned before. So what's going on in the 1960s? There's a bit of a mess in everything that I prepared, but we're working. Okay. In 1964, there's a very, very, very famous kind of public intellectual called Vance Packard, who was already known in the 1950s as a kind of critique of consumerism, and he published a book called The Naked Society. And one of the things that he mentioned, let's try to understand the kind of perspective during the 1960s. During this period, keep in mind, this is the Cold War. People are very afraid of surveillance. People are very afraid of the Eastern Bloc or the Soviet Union or however we want to call it. But people are also afraid from the government, especially in the US. And Packard, what he does in the book He's trying to understand or trying to show the readers it is a very, very readable book. It's like anything else that Pascal wrote. He's trying to explain to his readers how we as a society became more monitored and more visible to other people. And there's other kinds of means and inventions that make this possible. One, for example, is what he called the garrison mentality. The fact that it is the Cold War, and there's the FBI, and there's the CIA, and democratic governments have a lot of power, and they can use a lot of power, and they have a lot of surveillance power, and they monitor the citizens because they're afraid of communists. And what happens is not only governments, the government itself does it, but also other citizens do it. They go to the police or they go to the FBI and they go to say, I think my neighbor is a communist. And this is a kind of mentality that is going on where everything you do in the public sphere is being watched, and sometimes things that you do at home are seen by your neighbors. And that is a kind of mentality that, as he thinks in 1964, is gaining momentum. That's one thing. Second thing that he says, or one of the problems that he's talking about, is consumerist society. And that is related to one specific thing. At this time, and especially after the 1950s ended, and society became the American society, talking again here about American society mostly, when the kind of conservative era of the 1950s ended, people started buying more stuff. And how would they pay for it? Credit. Something that they didn't do in the past. So society started, people start to use more credits. They started more get more loans. And what do credit companies do? Who do they hire? Private investigators, because they want to make sure that the money that they give to their clients will be repaid. And there's a huge surge in the use of private investigators by credit companies at the time. It's not really credit card companies. This will happen a few years later and will shock citizens at the time. But there's a lot of private investigators working at the time to try and understand if people buy more than they can pay for, and they get too much credit, and they get credit from different companies, which will mean that they might default and will not be able to repay the loans and will not be able to pay the credit company. And that's a thing that is going on at the time. Packard's explanation, which essentially did not change from then until now, is that this is what motivates capitalist economy. People need to spend more than they earn, otherwise it won't work. And the invention of credit, again, something that comes from Christianity with credo, and we know this from the pages, but gains very different meaning this time. This is what keeps economy going. We need credit, we need credit companies in private investigators. They monitor everything you do. And this is how we end up with a naked society, or one of the reasons. What will happen when credit cards will be used is that the kind of monitoring that is being done or is taking place will be even more widespread. And people then, I think I mentioned it last week, people then will be shocked when someone else knows that they paid for something that no one else was supposed to know they paid for. And we have a lot of news stories about it, as you might imagine, that citizens outraged that the credit card company send them leaflets with advertising a motel saying, oh, you previously visited this one, maybe you would like this one. And no one was supposed to know that I was in that motel. It didn't, again, essentially, this works the same now. It's more complicated and more complex, but at that time, it seems to be a huge violation of privacy. That's the second. Third thing that Packard was talking about is the tracking devices became much more, much cheaper, as he calls it, the electronic eyes, ears, and memories, than they were in the past. This technology of bugging became much cheaper than it was during the early 1950s. A lot of people bought these kinds of tiny cameras that can take pictures of people. Other people bought these microphones where they could record people. And all of this kind of technology became a lot more affordable than it was a few years before. And the sentiment, again, is that everyone that I talk to, they might be recording, might be taking a picture, they might have a kind of secret microphone. And as you see also here, there's a lot of discussion about Orwell's 1984. Are we going to live in Orwell's 1984, where everything is seen, where everything is being monitored, and where everything can be recorded? And there's a really interesting and kind of obsession with 1984 during this period, especially 1964. It's 20 years from now, what will happen? Will we live in 1984, in Orwell's 1984? And Packard is not different from that way. And his final remark, which will be the one that we'll focus on and will continue to develop, is about computers. And we won't go too much into computers now. We'll finish talking about privacy, and then we'll go back and talk about computers. We'll take a short break and then talk about computers. But this is something that is going on at the time, and Packard is paying attention to this. How would computers and data influence our lives when we live in a much more organized society, where computers can or be used to find, as you see here, patterns, and where there's a thirst for a lot more computer processing to understand how society works. What would happen to our idea of privacy and to our private lives when this is something that is being used? Yeah.
I feel like there's still an obsession with 1984, and it really did not change from then, from everything.
It did. So I agree. There's a lot of like Orwellian discussions, and yes. Yes. It is very interesting to see like these discussions before 1984, then after, because for them, this is a future it's still possible. Ironically or not, in 1984, there's a really famous television commercial by Apple saying, use our computers so 1984 will not be like 1984. And it's a really strong sentiment at the time, kind of, I know, messianic visions of the future. What would happen in that year, 1984? So I agree with you. There's a lot of Orwellian references. Are we going to live in some world that is very similar to 1984? They seem completely different, because 1984 is still in the future. Who knows what would happen? So I agree, but it's a bit different, and again, it's kind of eschatological ideas of the future. This, when we reach that year, something magical would happen. It might be great, it might be horrible. In these kinds of visions, and I'll give you another one in a minute. It's kind of a dystopic society that is run by computers. And that's the terrifying future. Again, in 1984, Apple said, don't worry about it. We're doing computers in a completely different way, and 1984 won't be like 1984. If you haven't seen this TV ad, go to YouTube and find Apple's 1984 ad. It is iconic. It is really, really good. It is really, really clever, and it is now very, very famous. So take a look. So we'll focus on that, on this kind of risk that that might undermine our privacy. And at this time, there's a lot of concerns regarding data. How would data be used? Again, as I mentioned last week, data can only be used essentially by governments. There's no big corporations, there's no big tech companies, it's governments. And as in 1984, the nemesis of freedom is the government. It's not a private corporation or anything like that. So it's mainly the risk comes from how would democratic governments use data. And they might use it with all the best intentions to be more efficient, as you see, to develop efficient tools for tax collecting. But it might change the way that we live our lives and the kind of sense of freedom that we have when we know that this data can be processed. And there's another thing that happens with this kind of idea of processing, and it's the idea of computers and what computers are actually and what they are capable of doing. This is from 1961. It's a quote that I really, really like because again, it shows that not a lot changed from it's like 60 years ago, 62 years ago, almost to the day. This is a quote from Bernard Benson. Bernard Benson is the original high-tech hero. He started a computers company, a processing company. He sold it. He made a lot of money. He went to France. He had a vineyard, and he became a kind of technological guru at the time. Very similar to kind of people that we know today, but 60 years ago. And in a conference in 1961, he was talking about how we perceive computers and the kind of data that can be used and how it will be used, might be used. And as you see, he writes, your FBI record, your childhood disease, and the attitudes of your parents will be available, he said. As if that weren't enough to throw in your school records, employment records, tax records, contribution to charity, and even the records of your charge accounts and credit cards. Everything will be on computer. But that's not the whole story. The whole story comes to the final paragraph. What happens with computer processing? And as it says, if I make a statement about someone, you may or may not believe it. If I write it in an article, you will believe it more. In a book, it becomes nearly sacrosanct. But if the statement comes from a computer, mamma mia, it's like coming from God. It's in 1961. And it's not about whether it's right or wrong. It's about how we perceive computer power, coming from a guy who made a lot of money from computer power. And again, I really like this quote because it comes from someone who was working in the field and says what might be used and how consider this or how we'll perceive this. And that unpackaged, there's more examples. This is kind of the state of mind at the time. about the future of privacy. Everything will be known, everything will be exposed, governments will know everything about us, and they'll be able to push one button and know everything. And then the academics joined the party, and they start in 1964, 1965. There's different kinds of committees of legal scholars trying to understand the future of privacy, especially in the context of computers. And this is one example of Oscar Robhuizen. And one of his points that he's making is that the technological changes are so quick and fast that society needs to quickly adapt as well. We need to think about different kinds of legislations. We need to think about different kinds of ways to prevent this kind of political catastrophe from happening. And we need to adapt as a society, as individuals, and as governments. And one of the things that they say in this paper is, as you see, the essence of privacy is no more and certainly no less than the freedom of the individual to pick and choose for himself the time and circumstances under which, and most importantly, the extent of which, to which, his attitudes, beliefs, behaviors, and opinions are to be shared with or withheld from others. And that is a kind of, that's it signifying a new trajectory, because it takes into account the idea that in this society, the right to be let alone is no longer viable. We need to think about different ideas. And now, and again, that's one idea, and it will be developed by others, as you will soon see. It's the extent to which, how much other people, governments, institutions, how much access will they have? That's a completely different perspective regarding privacy from what was in the past, which would lead, as we'll soon see, to an idea of privacy as control, not as the right to be left alone or to be let alone, but as the right to control how much data will be shared with others, assuming that some kind of data must be shared with others. Now what we're talking about is the extent to which. And again, this is from 1965, and we'll see soon how this developed. But just kind of, if this is not clear, then please tell me, and I'll repeat that. Essentially, it means that we can't be left alone any longer. It is a new world, and that's one of the kind of motivations of why we need to think about this right as in a different way. And as Roy Hausen will describe it, human stated would be, it's not only the right to be let alone, but it's also the right regarding how much to share. These two things go together. And the idea of what becomes known as the kind of trade-off or the relationship, and it depends who interprets it, between sharing and concealment, what would be shared, what would not be shared, how much can I share, how much should I share, how much should be concealed, that is the kind of trade-off that we see now everywhere. No one, I think, now assumes that you can live isolated from everyone else, that what privacy is, because, and that's one of the points that they're starting to make, because if this is what privacy, that the right to be left alone, there's no privacy. So it's either changing the way that we think of privacy, coming up with new ideas regarding privacy, or to say, the idea of privacy is no longer relevant, at a time when we really need privacy, because there's computers, there's tapping, there's a lot of things going on. We need an idea of privacy, but we can't keep the old idea. So Rothhausen is one. The others is, I don't have it here. Oh no. Is Alan Weston. Let me try to find it because everything here is a mess. I'm not sure why. Yes, Alan Weston. Who in 1967 wrote the seminal book about privacy called Privacy and Freedom. Yes.
What year was for this?
Rothhausen.
What year was that?
This is 1960. That was 1965. This is 1967. Rothhausen, as you'll see here, added it forward to Weston, so they were all connected. Mainly in New York, I think. All of them were members of kind of a specialist group at the New York bar about the future of privacy. There's been a long debate for a few years how to come up with new ideas of privacy. Rothhausen was one of the first, but then Weston developed it into a full account of what privacy is. So this is 1967. And Weston's idea is still probably the most popular, if not one of the most popular ideas of privacy. It's still very, very widely used. It is still one that I think a lot of us still kind of intuitively think about when we think about privacy. And the idea is based on privacy and control, or privacy as control. And as you see in its definition, privacy is the claim of individuals, groups, or institutions to determine for themselves when, how, and to what extent information about them is communicated to others. Viewed in terms of the relation of the individual to social participation, privacy is the voluntary and temporary withdrawal of a person from the general society through physical or psychological means, either in a state of solitude or small group intimacy, or when among larger groups in a condition of anonymity or reserve. So I've highlighted the two parts of it. But privacy, again, is the claim of individuals or groups or institutions to determine from themselves when and how and to what extent information about them is communicated to others. And the idea of privacy as control, one of the things that they're trying to do at the time is to turn it into something that is more proactive than passive. It's not the right to be let alone. It's rational decisions that individuals make regarding themselves. It is me who decide how much and to whom information about me will be shared. And this kind of requires from individuals to know which data they might share, to know with whom they might share, etc. Again, when we'll talk about the GDPR or more recent ideas of privacy, they will still maintain this kind of logic. It is you that decide as a user, as a citizen, how much data will be shared. And that's why consent is so important. That you need to decide for yourself how much data is going to be shared. Yes.
But I cannot decide it for myself if I don't have the right to do so.
What do you mean?
I'm an individual
Yeah.
in the state, and if I don't have the right to claim actually privacy, and the state does not let me claim it,
Why not?
well, the state has provided privacy and freedom for me. I need to live in a state where these are rights or values which are present.
No, but that's all true for freedom of expression as well. So that's true for everyone.
Yes, right. But because we said, here we kind of talk more about the claim or an individual.
Yeah.
a rational decision. And before, when we were talking about the original text, we were talking about a right. And I was saying that both is connected, that it should become true, that in the end we actually have rights.
Yes, you're right, but it's not with the right to privacy, it's about the meaning of privacy. So the right to privacy here, as it will be, for example, in GDPR, would be that the European Union, in that case, gives you the right to decide how much data you want to be shared.
Exactly, that's what I'm saying.
Yes,
Yeah.
definitely. Yes, but as it is with other, discussion about rights, then it always gains, receives kind of a meaning from living with other people and other, a sovereign, who's, sovereign can decide if they want to give you rights or not, but once these rights are given, then the question is if you can fulfill these rights and maintain them.
I'm just saying it because there's the discussion that we should leave it to the individuals or to the groups, and they can decide for themselves if they want to have privacy, but this will not work if there is not the fundamental rights. So sometimes this is used as an argument to
No, definitely.
not do
Yeah.
that.
Right, I had an example that someone explained to me for the idea of control. Is that, when we go on the website and then we'll go to social media and we'll have articles for what we just saw or looked at.
Yes.
Then if you're signed up for it, most of the time it's a shopping website, that we sign up for them. None of us read the terms and conditions, but it says there, we look for it, that we allow that website to use that information to others. But if you didn't agree to that, then that was your control to saw your information. So the shopping website could see your data and what you were looking for, but Facebook couldn't because it didn't give that control. And for websites like Facebook, you don't really have that possibility. You can just, there isn't a button that says, no, don't give me information.
On Facebook, I think you can to some degree.
They added it in.
They added it, yeah.
Recently.
Recently. No, you can do it. There's also with websites, so there's like both technically and kind of in legislation, the difference between the data that is created when you use the platform and cookies, which is something completely different that has different kind of legislation. There's some kinds of cookies that are needed for the functionality of the website, and in that case, the website doesn't need to ask for consent. But there's other kinds of cookies that they need to ask for consent. So there's this is like legally, it is divided into different kinds of tools and features that are being used to create data from the user behavior. More questions on that? Okay, so again, one point to mention here, and following up on that comment, this is all in a democratic context. This is what not only a democratic, but what a liberal democratic society should look like, and that's why privacy and freedom are synonymous almost in this case. But also, it is not a kind of legitimization of complete withdrawal from society. As you see here, this is a temporary withdrawal from society. It doesn't say that in order to maintain privacy, you need to cut your ties from society and live in an isolated island. It's not like Henry David Thoreau's idea of how to live in the woods, because it assumes that there needs to be some kind of balance between privacy and participation. I need to share some kind of data with my guy. It's just that I need to decide how much data I need to share and how it should be used. However, we all know that data about us is being created all the time by governments. Otherwise, governments will not be able to function. We can't, and that is not a violation of our privacy. That's something that needs to be made very, very clear. In this book, it's a very, very long book. It's very interesting, and Westin really tries to make the connection, or the almost essential connection, between a modern liberal democracy and privacy, trying to turn privacy not only into a right, but a kind of manifestation of human freedom and liberty, which will create, or the decision regarding how much data will be shared is kind of a manifestation of ourselves as rational and liberal, which is the foundations of rational and free, which is the foundation, one of the foundations of liberal democracy. This is really a mess. I'm trying to look for something very specific, but everything is just a mess. Oh, yes. However, a year before, in 1966, Westin wrote a paper that was a bit more pessimistic, where he tried to also make the connection between 1984 and privacy. And it's really interesting. This is the title: Science, Privacy and Freedom, Issues and Proposals for the 1970s. It's in two parts, but it is fascinating. If you want to read about how people thought about privacy or data at the time, this is a really, really good place to start. And he talks about, again, 1984. And it comes from the person that a year later would write the seminal work on privacy that is still with us. And this is what he writes: these computer transaction systems and central record files of the future could bring enormous benefits to mankind in the form of planning, efficiency, and social control. Unless the issue of privacy is in the forefront of the planning and administration of such future computer systems, however, the possibilities of data surveillance over the individual in 1984 could be chilling. From the time he started driving or took a transportation facility to work, leaving a record at the toll or ticket booth, until he arrived at home at night, a person's movements and actions would be in the memory systems. At every step, when he parked at the garage, when he entered the office and registered in, when he used the telephone, his luncheon, his attendance at the theater or ball game, his store purchases, his stay at the motel, his visit to the doctor, all this would be on record. There would be few areas left in which anyone could move about in the anonymity of personal privacy, and few transactions that would not be fully documented for government examination. And that's the future in 1984 with computer power. But there's a sentence here that is really, really, really important. It is in 1966, it is at the height of the political discussions that will focus on after the break. But he says that unless the issue of privacy is in the forefront of the planning and administration of such computer systems. And that is a really important point, which puts into the kind of technological rush of developing new tools and using them in different ways, that privacy needs to be during the planning process. We need to think about privacy, because otherwise, everything that we do from the moment we wake up until we go to bed, everything will be recorded. By whom? By the government. That's what he thinks about. He doesn't know anything other than that. But it's really important. And it's one of the lessons from, again, the political story that we'll focus on after the break, that privacy needs to be when we plan these tools and when we plan the ways that it will be used. And it's a huge lesson that is already there in 1966. Questions? Okay. So, again, it's, if you want to read this, it's really important to understand the kind of ideas that are going on at the time. We sometimes use, obviously, different kind of technological terminology from the one that we use today, and it naturally makes sense because it lives in a very different world. But the point here is tremendously important, that when we plan something, we need to think about privacy. And before we go to have a bit of a break, then
Don't you think that this kind of outlook really stems out of this kind of cultural climate in which there is this some sort of paranoid relationship between the or paranoid fear of the government as like some sort of overlord. Because nowadays that there is plenty of that generation. Like one of the big topics I'm thinking of, like about public administration, for example, is the digitalization of public administration and individuals asking the governments, look, take example from the private sector and do not ask us about just taking, it's there. So this kind of idea is very related to some like a cultural moment in which they were afraid of like the McCarthyism and that kind of like they were actually interested in your private life, your private beliefs. But I don't think this turned out to be the case most of the times.
so I think at that, so what at this time in the like second half of the 1960s, it's no longer about McCarthyism or it's more about consumerism. It's about what kind of data you produce at every point of your lives and how it might be used by governments. Now, I agree completely that the way that they perceive the government is different from the way that we perceive the government in most cases. Not always, because we still, like, during COVID, people had other ideas about what the government can do and how it can use data. And in Europe, for example, it was very difficult for some governments to use personal data because of, for example, the GDPR. So I agree completely. They think about the world in a different way. They have a very specific view of computers. They when they think about how everything will be registered is in a different way, how everything will be processed is in a different way. But the idea of the government is not just because they are afraid of the government. It is also because this is the only entity that uses computers. There's nothing else really that uses computers.
Maybe because like this was a turning point too. So when things are happening, you are not sure how they will turn out to be. So it's easier to get pessimistic about it and kind of apocalyptic.
Yeah. But it's not that different from what is going on today. Regarding the future of technology and freedom, and we'll all be slaves to technology. That's one of the things that I find very interesting in this story, because this could have been written 2 years ago with a bit of different terminology and a bit of, the nemesis might be a bit different. Everything will be on record. Everything will be used. How can you, keep yourself in a place that is not seen by others? But what is interesting about that text is that it's coming from the person who wrote about privacy in the most elaborate way at the time, and almost sense. Yeah.
We were talking about the text that you showed.
Yeah, Westings.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that there actually question of planning.
Yeah.
They try to put the concept by design with actually values or rights such as privacy and freedom, and they emphasize that computer scientists or computer engineers should by design.
Yeah, definitely. No, definitely. The problem was for them that it didn't exist in the 1960s.
Yes.
It takes 50 years to come up with, this realization again, that there's some kind of ethical concepts that need to be implemented or put into these systems when they are being designed. When we'll talk about, for example, national AI strategies, this is one of the main points that is being discussed there. How can we create an ethical AI? One of the ideas would be that, everyone who studies data science or computer science will be forced to take, university classes in ethics and understand the meaning of ethics and what is the right thing to do and what's not the right thing to do. At that time, they have no idea. And let's end with a poem, again, from that period called Deep Privacy, that was very popular at the time. And again, although we feel unknown, ignored, and unreported blanks, take heart, our vital selves are stored in giant data banks. Our childhoods and maturities efficiently complied, our stocks and insecurities are permanently filed. our tastes and our proclivities engross in particular, our incomes, our activities, both extra and curricular, and such will be our happy state until the day we die, when we'll be snatched up by the great computer in the sky. And we'll end with that, especially because of the reference and the direct reference to the data banks. And we'll take a break, and when we come back, we'll talk about the data banks. And as you'll see, this was a political struggle between people who pushed forward with using technology and especially data processing, and those that said, let's think about privacy first. And one of the lessons would be privacy by design. And we'll take 10 minutes and we'll come back.
Hello, Guy, are you there? Guy?
When is the lesson today again?
7:45.
75, okay. And another question, do you have the Western text? Because it's not in the
No, it's not in
the data library like online, and
It's not?
It's not, and it's very difficult to get it on Google.
Really?
I tried to get it. Maybe I could.
It's I think. Let me check.
If
I
you
think
have
it's on the web archive.
Okay, if you have it, maybe we can upload it online.
I'll put it on.
Okay, thank you.
Hello, Guy, are you there?
Hire, so I gotta, you should like, you can. No, I think she meant like, you should hire. יש זה פשוט נורא קשור, יש תמי מיידס באמירה פרוס, הזכות לפרטיות, והיא מדברת על כל הפשוטים, היא לדעתי התמקדה, כאילו ניסיתי קצת את הקורס לפני שנתיים, היא התמקדה רק בעומקים ישראלים. והיא דיברה על בירלנד, ורות גג, במקום על זה.
אבל בירנק נגיד מאוד מאוד מושפע מווסט.
כן, הוא מצטט אותו בהכל. כן, הוא מעביר את הקורס הזה במשפטים, והיא מעבירה את זה במדע המדינה.
רות גג זה מראה. היה להם ויכוח ארוך שנים על